feel free to fan yourselves. It is warm day. Even though here we are on Labor Day weekend, and in some ways, emotionally, it's the end of summer. But we know that the cycle of the seasons is still going around and not officially in fall yet. But soon enough, yellow school buses will come around, and it will indeed be fall. The reading that we've heard from Luke today is one of 19 different stories that the Gospel of Luke contains about meals and placing Jesus in this context of being at a table and enjoying a feast and hospitality. For Luke, this is really unique that he has 13 of those stories that are just in Luke. The others are shared with some of the other synoptic Gospels, but there is this sense that for Luke, the importance of a meal is really intended to share something very vital with his community. Remembering that Luke is writing his Gospel after all of the events have happened and Jesus has been crucified, died, buried, resurrected, all the experiences at a time when the early Christian community is really under a lot of challenge about what it believes in the face of the context of the Roman Empire, in which they're under a lot of pressure from a lot of sides to not believe what they do. So in this constant sort of feeding, if you're a foodie at all, Luke is your gospel. and I remember from my own self, my life, how certain meals and fellowship were so vital. Some of my favorite childhood memories come from those childhood opportunities when family come together for big meals. And aren't we about to launch into a season here with the fall of some really great food and fellowship around meals? And for some, that's actually really challenging. And so how do we be together with one another in times when, maybe we can't eat so much, or we're aware that there are people across the world that don't have that opportunity to eat well or eat at all. And so, but this fellowship of the meal then, in that context, becomes very powerful. I remember when I was invited one time to contribute a recipe to a folklore cookbook. First of all, the idea of me contributing a recipe is hilarious. Just want you to know that and be up front. But I was asked, the idea was to write a story about the recipe in which the recipe is used in the context of your short story. So I wrote about how my great-grandma, who was born into sort of a Pennsylvania farm community of the Pennsylvania Dutch, was the age of 8 when she became fully responsible for all the household meals. And not just for her father and brothers, but for some cousins and other farm hands that worked on that farm. That's a lot of food to suddenly be able to make and create at the age of 8. And that's why I'm so fortunate to have a few of these recipes, and that was the context in which I put it in my story about her, and about how this recipe for Thanksgiving turkey stuffing had come down to us from my great-grandma. And at the age of 8, she was writing down everything as she created it, and the very start of this particular recipe for sage stuffing starts with her writing down, first, go out in the backyard and catch a turkey that doesn't run too fast. Can you imagine at the age of 8, knowing how to dress a turkey or figuring it out, right? And then cooking. But that is such a wonderful kind of way to remember her and pass that story along with that recipe. And then when we sit down and have these feasts together, there's so much that happens in them. We're finally catching up with the relatives that we haven't seen for a long time. Maybe we're seeing crazy Uncle Joe or Aunt Jane. And just, it's good that they're alive, but that's once a year is enough, right? But we're checking in with each other. And then there's Christmas coming up for us, another time of coming together. And then these times also not only check us in with the living that we love, but we're also often reminded very poignantly of people who are no longer with us. And so we remember how we're connected to those ancestors and generations and people we love. And in the Christian faith, when we share a meal, that's part of what we want to do. We want to remember our ancestors. In fact, everything about Luke's gospel ends up really illuminating the importance of this meal at this table. And how one of the last meals that happens is at the Passover meal, before Jesus leaves his apostles and is killed and later resurrected. And then in Luke, the very last meal that he shares is on the road to Emmaus, how some apostles don't recognize Jesus until they sit down and have a meal and break bread together. That Jesus is present to them in that. And that in Eucharist for us, we're reminded every time we do this that Jesus is present to us. In the old Greek language that was translated into Latin for this service, we have an original translation that says, let us do this and break this bread that Christ might be with us again. We do it as remembered. But if you think about that literally, let us do this so that Jesus can be put together again, remembered. If we are the body of Christ, when we do this fellowship around this table, Christ is present to us because we are bringing ourselves to this table. In the offertory movement that happens and the bread and the wine come forward, those symbols of Christ that we are offering, that God has given to us, just as God gave us Christ. To this holy fellowship, we offer bread and wine of our own resources. We're making ourselves present to God. And that idea of God being available and present to the people is an innovation in theology that Christ brings to us. We remember that the context of this story is that Jesus is hanging out at a home of the Sadducees, a head Sadducees, so someone fairly important. One thing to know historically about the Sadducees is Pharisees. I apologize. He's with the Pharisees in contrast to the Sadducees. So with the Pharisees and this head Pharisee, one thing to know historically is the difference between Sadducees and Pharisees a little bit. With the Pharisees, they're representing what we might today be called a popular movement. They were not associated with royalty or an ancient lineage of priests. The Sadducees were rather associated historically with those who were called sages and scribes. So they're a little bit closer to the people and populist in that way, a little more democratic in how they understood the accessibility of God. In fact, they believed two important things: that the divine would exist outside of the temple. That was pretty amazing. The Sadducees, as a contrast, who were a royal priesthood and associated with nobility, said that God was definitely kept in that box and could only be dealt with in that box. So the Pharisees, by contrast, are also kind of informed in a really amazing way about the law of Moses, and they have an oral tradition that the Sadducees rejected. The Sadducees were very much literalists, whereas the Pharisees said we have a whole oral kind of commentary that becomes the Talmud in the Jewish tradition that also informs from human experience our ability to understand God's presence among people. What that means is that Jesus is here at a Pharisee's home, a fairly moderate to liberal sort of fellowship, but still attached to these social norms of the time, which was very much classist and still associated the kind of right way to be faithful with the purity codes of the law. You know, you had to behave a certain way, do certain things, keep the not clean people apart from the clean people, things like that. And so what he's really trying to deconstruct by what he's talking about to these Pharisees is he's really trying to deconstruct, let's not be co-opted by the social norms. We have to move beyond that to understand that the kingdom of God is really inviting us to a radical inclusion that asks us to challenge norms that we take for granted. The way that that translates for me today could be in one way when we talk about white privilege. It's not always very comfortable to go to anti-racism trainings that are offered by our diocese or by the national church. But it's important to go to those kinds of things, just even as a reflection for ourselves. Because when we're so used to how we can move through the world, our lives might indeed be challenging as white people, but we aren't confronted with so many barriers as our friends and neighbors and people of color. So to look at our assumptions is an important reflection, and Jesus is asking his followers to do that, to say who's not included here, who's being excluded here. And the way that we can do it is to not allow ourselves to be co-opted into it. When we go into a place, don't assume privilege. Wait until we're invited. And kind of let go of the arrogance that our opinion is going to be welcome. Let go of the understanding that the white Western narrative is the only one that informs this country. We know that's not true. We know that's not true. There's a wonderful phrase that St. Paul writes in his letter to the Hebrews that we just heard, which is, keep loving one another mutually. This is like this really essential quality of the law, reminding ourselves that Paul himself was a Pharisee. And that as a Pharisee, as many did, they were welcoming in Christ to a different understanding of themselves. And Paul talks about how we need to be hospitable to strangers, to the people who we think we don't know and ought not to be privileged. Be hospitable to the strangers because thereby you entertain angels unaware. When I read that, I cannot help but wonder how many messengers of God we currently have imprisoned at our border. I cannot help but wonder how many messengers of God are unjustly imprisoned because they are people of color, accused wrongly of things they did not commit. I cannot help but feel great sorrow and a sense of powerlessness about what to do to be mindful of the people who have come to us as strangers, seeking to contribute what God has made in them to this country. When through our history, so many of people who have done inventions or made scientific leaps, who brought us great prosperity, whose prosperity of this nation goes forward on their shoulders in history. How we need to do better. How each generation is called in every kind of moment given to us to ask the question, who is being excluded from God's table? Do we need to excuse ourselves from that table or step aside so that someone else can feast there? That our privilege as people of any kind, whenever we know that privilege, we are continually asked to make room. And not just to make room, but as St. Paul says, to allow ourselves the extent of empathy to wonder, what would it be like to be that person who is in prison? I must act as though I were. What would that be like to be someone who has nothing? I must act as though I were. All of that imagining around the kingdom of God is ours to make possible as people of faith. And not in all those grand and glorious ways, but rather in every small way that says, I want to be intentional about inviting you to the feast. This is all a foreshadowing of the kingdom that God would have us know. And as St. Paul says, that Christ has been and is and will be forever. And it is in our power every day to make the kingdom possible, knowable, so that we can all feast together on God's grace. In Christ's name.